David Talbot, United States Army, Vietnam. David served as a medevac pilot, a dust-off pilot in Vietnam. He went to Vietnam in July of 1967 after graduating from flight school. He served over there with the 45th Medical Company, which is a part of the 44th Medical Brigade in Long Binh. And boy, I love these dust-off stories. I don't have a lot of them, but some of these medevac pilots, unsung heroes, dear Lord. They saw it all, they did it all, and just, I know the ground troops really appreciated our medevac pilots. So David Talbot is one of my medevac pilots from Vietnam, and just a great story here on the Voices of History YouTube channel. I want to thank Scott Charney. Scott, thank you for dedicating this story to our YouTube audience and sponsoring it. I appreciate your help in sponsoring this and helping me get these stories out there, and your commitment to our country and our veterans, Scott. I really appreciate your support. And I want to thank you. Look in that camera and say, God bless you, and I salute you. Folks, if you'd like to sponsor a story, it's a feel-good project. There's information in the video description and on my website, larrycapetto.com. Click on the link that says Sponsor a Vet. Take a look at all the pictures of these veterans and include their name in the sponsorship. I hope you really would consider doing so. I know a lot of you want to sponsor these stories. There's information on donating to my work in the comments section of this video. Voices of History Radio is broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, folks. These stories will be on there eventually, so I encourage you to download the apps on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, and just have it in the palm of your hands. Supplement your day. Listen, you can't get enough of this. A lot of you binge watch these videos. You can listen to it too. Truck drivers out there, this is a perfect platform for you. Students in schools, in the palm of your hands, at your fingertips, living history. So I encourage you to share this with a young person, those of you watching this video, and get this word out there. Freedom is not free, freedom is earned. These are the stories, folks. Embedded in these stories are why we're free today. I thank God every day for the veteran stories that I've recorded over the years. So I want to share them with you. So subscribe to this YouTube channel, and sponsor a veteran if you can, and also listen to the radio station, folks. It's just a blessing to have that. I'm very grateful for it. So, all right, that's enough for now. I will talk to you soon on an upcoming broadcast. Enjoy this story from one of my medevac pilots, David Talbot. Okay, David Talbot, you were with, give me the battalion, the regiment, the army, that you're a dust-off pilot. Give me all the coordinates of who you are, who you were back in Vietnam, and who you were with.
Okay, my first tour, when I left, I graduated from flight school in January of '67. Sylvia was pregnant at the time with our first child, and the baby was born actually 1 week before I graduated. So the Army deferred my deployment to Vietnam and sent me to Fort Bragg. And I joined the 45th Medical Company in Fort Bragg, which were getting ready to deploy to Vietnam. Okay. And so that was, we took a short detour to Fort Sam Houston for 4 or 5 weeks of medical training. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that all pilots would have to be trained as medics before they could be a medical pilot. And then we went to Fort Bragg. We were there about 6 months, and in July of '67, we deployed to Vietnam, and I was with the 45th Medical Company, which was part of the 44th Med Brigade, which had an area responsibility in Vietnam, generally speaking, north of Saigon, but basically the Saigon area. We were located in a place called Long Bin, and it was near Benoit, Long Bin, Cu Chi, Dao Tien, Lai Kei, Quan Loi, Phuc Vinh, and we also supported the Australians who were down in Nui Dat and Vung Tau. So that was basically 3 Corps. We were area support for 3 Corps. We weren't part of a divisional unit.
Okay. Did you enlist?
Yes.
Okay.
I was in college at the University of Miami on a deferment, and Sylvia and I already had been married. We got married in high school, and the University of Miami was, we were there sort of studying, and I flunked out. And after about 6 months after I flunked out, I got a letter from my draft board saying, we understand that you haven't applied for your deferment for this semester. Can you please advise? So I ran right down to before I even responded to the draft board, I ran down to the enlistment area, and I enlisted with a contract for flight school. So I had to take the flight physical and go through all the tests and everything, but I was accepted to flight school. So I was guaranteed a slot to flight school. I went to basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. And instead of AIT, which most infantry people go to, we went to Fort Walters, Texas for basic flight training. That was 6 months. And then Fort Rucker, Alabama for the last half of the class. And I graduated in January of '67.
Well, before you even went in, what were your thoughts about Vietnam?
To tell you the truth, I didn't have any thoughts about Vietnam. Sylvia and I were just married. We were having a good time. We were down in Miami. We bought a boat. We had a motorcycle. We were goofing off. We were having a lot of fun. And the only thought that occurred to me was when I got that draft notice that I needed my deferment, that if I went in the military and I got drafted, then I thought I would be sent to Vietnam. And I figured if I could be a pilot like my dad was a pilot in World War II, if I could be a pilot like my dad, I would always have probably a roof over my head and a hard stand to sleep on, a cot or something like that, and warm food. And so I said, I better try and be a pilot. At that time, even though I didn't have a degree, the Army was accepting pilots to the Warrant Officer Candidate Training Program. That's what I was in. I was a Warrant Officer Candidate.
And so you're going through your training. Are you thinking ahead to, I might be in combat someday? Or what were your thoughts through your training? In
training, they trained us specifically for a combat role. And so they told us right from the beginning, even in basic training, the emphasis was on, here's what's going to happen to you when you get to Vietnam. Most of the people that trained me in basic training were Korean War vets. And Drill Sergeant Murphy, I hope he's still alive somewhere, he was my drill sergeant, one hell of a great guy. I really loved that guy. And my trainers in flight school were all Vietnam veterans, returnees, because I went to flight school in '66, and so the first group of aviators were coming back to Vietnam, going to Fort Rucker and becoming instructor pilots, and they taught both the flying portion and the ground schools were almost all Vietnam veterans already. And so it was on our mind. We knew we were going to go to Vietnam. That wasn't even a question. We knew that's where we were headed.
You're how old now?
I'm 62.
So how old were you back when you first toured?
I went to Vietnam, let's see, my first tour was '67. I was 23. And had one son, 6 months old. I missed his first year, I missed 12 months out of his life, and on my second tour, I missed 12 months out of my daughter's life and out of his life again. That was the hardest part, I think.
What's the attitude of the other pilots training to go to Vietnam? Is it kind of like, we're invincible, nothing's going to happen to us, or was there any apprehension about what you're doing, or was it just pretty much adrenaline thing and you're going? I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, we were all enlistees. We all enlisted for this. We knew we were going. We were pretty much figured that nothing was ever going to happen to us. And sadly, quite a few of the guys in my class didn't make it. But our thinking was, we're definitely invincible. We're gonna fix this war, and we're gonna have it done within our first 12 months, and the war is gonna be over, and we're gonna be back home.
Tell me about your actual deployment over to Vietnam. Do you remember where you were? Did you fly from a point, and then when you got to Vietnam, and when you stepped on the ground, what did you experience? What was it Vietnam, what you thought it was going to be as far as a country, the geography, or what did you experience when you first got in country?
Well, after the medical training and we went to Fort Bragg, I was home in Miami. We're from Miami. Not born there, but my wife is from Cuba. I'm from Chicago, but we met in high school in Miami. So I was home on leave, and I got a call that we were deploying. Fortunately, they needed a group of volunteers to accompany our aircraft. We got all brand new Hueys, brand new, top of the line H model UH-1s, and I was the escort officer, one of 5 escort officers and about 60 enlisted guys that got to go on the ship that carried our aircraft over to Vietnam. So we were on a World War II Jeep carrier, the United States naval ship Kula Gulf. What a great aircraft carrier. And there were 3 units on board we met the ship in Oakland, and so we flew from Fort Bragg to Oakland, and in Oakland we deployed on July 4th, and crossed under the Bay Bridge in the aircraft carrier with our aircraft, and there was a Bird Dog unit, an O-1 unit, Bird Dogs, and there was a Mohawk unit. A Mohawk is a high-performance aircraft that the Army used for surveillance. It was a 2-seat high-performance aircraft. It was really a great aircraft for surveillance. So these 3 units were on board this aircraft carrier. The ship was entirely manned by Merchant Marine. That's why they call it United States Naval Ship instead of USS. It was brought out of mothballs for the Merchant Marine to ferry equipment. So it was supposed to be a 21-day trip over to Vung Tau. Along the way, we had lifeboat drills, and on the second lifeboat drill, a crewman fell overboard and hit the lifeboat on the way down. This is not one of our guys, it was one of the Merchant Marine sailors, and broke his leg. So we had to deviate from our course, and we had to go to Honolulu, drop him off, and then we continued on to Vung Tau. Fortunately, we found out when we got to Vung Tau and processed in, that 30 days that we were actually on the water counted off our tour. So my tour started the day we went underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, and 30 days, we didn't get there for 30 days, well, 28 days. But the day we stepped off the ship, a week before we got there, our crew started taking the coverings off of the Hueys, and so my job, along with the rest of the officers, once we got to Vung Tau, was to fly the newly unwrapped Hueys over to the maintenance area to have them checked out and sent up to the unit. Our first night, we got off the boat, we got onto shore, and it was like we had on the sea for 30 days. The one thing that struck me, and to this day I'll never forget, is the smell. I don't know how graphic you want me to be, but the smell of kerosene burning is everywhere because, in most places, because there's no facilities, no toilets. So they would take the outhouses and take 55-gallon drums, cut them in half, and fill them that half with kerosene, and then when they were full, they would burn the kerosene. That smell, I will never forget that smell. That's everywhere that I was in Vietnam. So my first impressions coming off the boat and stepping onto land in Vietnam was the smell. It was also a very, it's a lot like the vegetation's a lot like Miami, a very Caribbean, maybe even more like Cuba, where Sylvia's from. And it's a smell of dense vegetation as well. So those 2 things, it's the smell that first thing that hit me. No fear. They gave us weapons, and we flew our aircraft over to Vung Tau to the maintenance depot, flew back, picked up some more aircraft, flew back and forth, and then we drove up to our unit at Long Binh, and we were an entire unit. By that time, see, the rest of the unit had flown over and they were waiting for us. So they were a whole company full of brand new aviators, brand new to Vietnam for the most part. We picked up three detachments that were already there, that joined us. And as a result, I didn't get to fly very much. I was never in very much danger. It took me 4 or 5 months to become an aircraft commander instead of just a pilot, because we just didn't fly a lot. And not only that, but most medevac missions just weren't that long. It was fly in, pick up the wounded, get it back to the hospital, and wait for the next call. So
well, let me stop you with that now. You were trained to be a dust-off pilot from the start?
No, sir.
Okay.
This is my opinion. The Huey flies the same no matter what your mission is. So you have the same red lines, you have the same parameters, you have the same envelope. You can't fly any faster, you can't fly any slower, you can't fly any higher, you can't fly any lower. Everything is exactly the same no matter what your mission is. You're basically flying in the same airplane. So when I left flight school, I was trained in the Huey. Now, as for operational specifications, once I got to Vietnam, we did some training on landing in tight LZs, tight landing zones, landing under fire, but so did the aircraft, the Hueys that belonged to other units that were bringing out supplies and food and mail and beer and ice and that kind of stuff. So specific mission training I got when I got to Vietnam. So I was not trained specifically as a dust-off pilot. I was entered the dust-off unit, and then they gave me mission briefings, mission training, and they trained us for the extraction of wounded and sick troops out of the field.
Can you walk me through some missions as far as the wounded and what you experience, who's on board, if there's gunships before you?
Sure.
Just take me on a mission and picking up the wounded. I want to hear what happens.
Every mission, there was no such thing as a routine mission. Okay, every mission had its idiosyncrasies. And there was 2 different kinds of missions. They were 24 hours a day, day and night. They were all weather. And on a typical mission, we would be sitting on standby. The unit in the field would, wherever the wounded were, would call to their higher headquarters. The higher headquarters would then call to area support, which would then relay the call to us. Now, it seems like that would be a long time, but basically, call up, call over, call down, maybe within 2 minutes we get the call. So we'd run out to the aircraft. We had usually 2 standby crews. One was first up, then one was second up, then we'd have a third up, so there were really 3 standbys, but first up was all urgent missions, possible loss of life or limb within 3 or 4 hours. Second up was for other types of extractions that weren't urgent. And then third up was patient transfers between hospitals. Then, if first up was busy, second up, which handled the more routine missions, became first up until first up got back. And third up became first up at night. So you were rotating the crews throughout a 24-hour period. So on a normal mission, we'd get a call. The pilot, the crew chief, and the medic would run to the aircraft, prepare it, get it started. The aircraft commander would come from the operations shack with a mission sheet in his hand that had the map, the coordinates, how many patients, what to expect, what kind of enemy situation. Was it hot? In other words, was there fire going on? Bullets flying through the LZ, or was it just a routine pickup? And the pilot would pick up and take off as the aircraft commander was getting strapped in, get his helmet on, getting on the radio and everything. So we'd fly out, and as we get near a pickup zone, we would call the unit on the ground and we'd ask them to pop smoke. A typical error would be the unit on the ground would say, "I'm popping yellow smoke." When they did that, yellow smoke would pop up all over the place because the bad guys were listening on the radios. And we'd say, no. Don't tell us what color you're popping. You pop the smoke, we'll identify the color. And then when we see the color, the smoke is trailing up through the sky, through the cloud, through the canopy, or from the LZ. It would also tell us what direction the wind was at, and then we would ask them on the ground, what's the enemy situation like, and then we would set up a pattern and land, pick up the wounded. They throw the wounded in the back, either the ambulatories or the litter patients would throw them on back. We had the capability of carrying 3 litters, stacked 1 litter in front of the bottom litter, and 2 ambulatory on each side. We called the hellhole in the back. We did not carry weapons in the units that I was in. We did not carry machine guns because we felt that a door gunner and 2 door gunners, and the ammo would take the spot of 4 possible patients. So if it was hot, if it was a hot LZ, we'd ask for gunship support, and they would be there. When we got there, they would hose down around where the enemy was firing from, and we would come in and land and take off and get out. And so once we had the patients on board, and there many times there would be 2, 3, 4, 1, 6, 8. We don't know how many patients, we would know when we're going there, but a lot of times what we would get when we got there wouldn't be exactly what we were expecting. Things happen in combat, and it's never a static situation. It's always moving. And so we would get them on board, and then in 3 Corps, where we were the area support, we had a triage, electronics or on the radio triage facility that we would call in and say, I forget the call sign, this is Dust Off 40, that was my call sign. On board we have 3 patients. One is a head case, one's a gunshot wound to the head, another one's traumatic amputation, one's a fever of unknown origin, one is bad gash or something, or a burn. And they would tell us then, based on the availability of the operating rooms that they knew of, which hospital to take them to. For example, head cases always went to the 24th Surge. Burn patients, we tried to get them out to the hospital ship Sanctuary, which was offshore, and take them out there because they had facilities for burns. And so they would tell us where to take the patients. So we would, after being given instructions where to take them, we would call the hospital, and when we landed at the hospital, they would have appropriate medical people there to meet us and take the wounded and bring them into the hospital. Then there was other missions, for example, that's a typical mission where we landed in a landing zone. Other missions, like a hoist mission, for example, where you couldn't land. We carried a hoist. First up, almost always had a hoist. One of the 3 ups had a hoist. A hoist was a little machine that looked like a little arm, and you could rotate it out, and it had a winch on it, and it had 256 feet of cable, and we could carry like 400 pounds or 375 pounds. And so we would have to come over and hover over the place, drop the hoist, bring the patient up, and bring him into the aircraft, and then take off.
I want you to slow it down just a bit for me with the patients, whatever comes to your mind, David, but tell me about any interaction you had with the wounded, with the corpsmen. Is there a particular mission that comes to mind as far as the severity of the cases, a hot LZ? Give me 1 or 2 examples and slow it down a bit. If you said you threw the patients in the back, I mean, what are you seeing? What are you hearing when this is going on? Are you just relaxed? Are you let's go, go, go? What is it, chaotic? Are you having any interaction with those patients, or the corpsmen, or the grunts? Or?
Okay, the pilots never had any direct interaction with the patients. When we got in the landing zone, one pilot was on the controls, and the other pilot was probably turning his head and looking back to see what was going on. But it was typically, we were usually pretty calm, usually. Much chaos, especially if it was a hot LZ. What they would do is the ground troops who had the patients would come running up with a litter. Our medics and our crew chiefs, one on one side, one on the other, depending on which side the patients were coming from, would reach over and help with the litter and bring the litter on board. And so one of the ground people and one of my crew would be lifting the first one as high as it could go, because they were stacked 3 high in the helicopter. And then the next one, and then the last one, and then one next to the last. The issue would be how heavy is the patient, but the most critical issue, and what the ground people most often misdid in their angst, or they were in such a hurry to get a patient on board, they would bring the most urgent ones to us first. And that was wrong, because once the first one would go up to the highest spot in the aircraft, and almost impossible to work on because it was right next to the ceiling. So we would tell them, no, 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 get the urgent ones on last. Get the least urgent ones up first, so we could stack them and have the most urgent ones on the ground. The medic and the crew chief both cross-trained each other. The crew chiefs became pretty good medics, and the medics became pretty good crew chiefs. They both cross-trained. And I can remember a mission in Laos where we picked up some people just inside from Laos, where we had so many wounded on board that my crew chief and my medic were strapped with they wore a little vest that had a cable strapped to it was like a strap attached to a hook on the floor, and they were standing on the skids as I flew back to Khe Sanh, and they were doing mouth to mouth. They were doing CPR on an individual. The crew chief at one end was pushing on his chest, leaning way into the cabin, standing on the skids, and the medic was giving him mouth to mouth, leaning over and the guy was dead when they threw him on board. He had no pulse, no respiration, and by the time we got to Khe Sanh, which was less than a 15-minute flight, he was both pulse and respiration. He was back. He brought him back, and getting chills down my back. But that guy made it. He made it, and so there are no typical patients. I'll give you another case. Thanksgiving night, 1967. There was a fire base just outside of Quan Loy. It was getting overrun. And it was exactly, if you ever saw the John Wayne Green Beret picture where they get overrunning the fire base, that's exactly what it was like, except there was no structures there. It was just little bunkers. You know, it was like in the movie, we had a lot of extra buildings and stuff. This was just a fire base out in the middle of no place, just outside of Quan Loy, just north of Lai Khe, and it was being overrun. This is Thanksgiving 1967. And when we got a call, it was definitely a hot LZ. And they had like 21 casualties and a bunch of killed. These were wounded and a bunch that were dead. So we made 3 runs that night, 3 or 4 runs to pick up the patients. This was at night. And when we got the call, we went out. They could not light up the fire base because of the danger. So they had 2 M60 machine guns that fired across the place where we had to land, where the injured were. They were firing across and making an X. And what we did was we landed on the machine guns fire tracers. So you see the red tracers going like this. And as we were landing, they cut off their machine guns when we were just about to be hit by their own weapons and by our own people's firing. So they stop. They load the patients on. And in that case, they did just throw them on, because this was a hot LZ. The bad guys were right at the perimeter, and they had to get them on and get us out of there in a hurry, because even though the bad guys couldn't see us, because we were lights out. We had no landing lights, no position lights. We came in totally blacked out, landing on this red X formed by these tracers, and they literally threw the patients on board. And we took them off to Quan Loy. We came back to Quan Loy and came back. On the last trip back, they asked us if we could take some of the bodies. As a dust-off unit, as a practical matter, we never picked up any dead people, any KIAs. The reason was our job was to save people, and if they were already dead, there's nothing we could do. They could wait till morning and send them out with the regular routine resupply ships. In this particular case, they said, they only had 2 wounded. They said, can you take some of the dead? So I said, sure, go ahead. And so they put 2 bodies, the first body in, the second body in, they threw him on. And he had been on a patrol. They had a suspended Claymore mine in the trees, and they blew it when the guy walked right by it, and they ripped off both of his arms and both of his legs. And when they threw his body onto the body of the other guy, this guy had had a quadruple amputation, went, oh, he wasn't dead. So my medic and my crew chief looked at each other and said, what do we do? He wasn't even bleeding. Evidently, when the wounds, when they ripped his arm, the muscles contracted to the point where they stopped the flow of blood. Now, he was oozing, but he wasn't bleeding to death. And we got him back, and he made it. And they went to work on him. You know, bravery comes in all different colors, in all different ways. He says to my medic, there's nothing you can do for me. Take care of the other wounded guys first. Special place in heaven for a guy like that. So when we left in a landing zone, it was pretty chaotic that night. and many missions like that. And we weren't going to a hospital. We were bringing him back to Quan Loy, which was an aid station. This is in the 1st Infantry Division. And those guys were going to triage him and then send for another dust-off to bring him down to the hospitals. And so we got about 21, 22 guys. I don't remember exact count. And that one guy, he actually made it. And here, I'll give you another case. We never decided who was a bad guy and who was a good guy. So in dust-off units, we picked up the wounded. Many cases we picked up NVA, Viet Cong. I think some of us picked up a few Russians from time to time, some Chinese, and we took them to the hospital and we let the people back at the hospital worry about their politics. All our job was to get wounded people to the hospital. Here's another one. We many times were called out to pick up a dog because the guys on the ground had these scout dogs, these German Shepherds and other dogs. Now, these were dogs, but try and tell the handler that this isn't a buddy of his. But here's the problem. The handler is the only person in that squad who's allowed to get close to the dog. They don't want the dog to be too friendly, I guess, with the other people. I don't know. Anyway, we had many hoist missions where we had to pick up either the handler was wounded or the dog was wounded. In either case, who do you bring up first? Do you bring up the handler? Then who's going to put the dog on the hoist? Or you bring up the dog, who's going to take the dog off the hoist inside the cabin? So those missions got kind of touchy, and usually we brought the dog up first, and then we bring the handler up, because the handler would get the dog on the hoist. The dog was real happy to get off the hoist, so he would bring him in, get him in onto the aircraft, and then bring up the handler. Other cases, like for example, things that happened every once in a while we'd take fire, and I can remember one case where we took a round in a smoke canister that one of the troops that we had just picked up had on his body, and the entire cabin filled up with smoke. And it was lucky we didn't kill ourselves trying to clear the smoke out of the cabin. There was other things that we did, and dust-off pilots, probably more than most, did night extractions, more than most people. And I lost some buddies who tried to do extractions at night. One of the hardest things for me personally, was during Lamson 719. I was in the 101st. That was in the spring of 1971. An individual got wounded. We brought him to the aid station, and he needed to get to Quang Tri, to the hospital right away. In the meantime, one of our aircraft had gone down. It was shot down. Now the guys were okay, but they were with the unit on the ground, and they were fighting their way to the top of a hill so they could be extracted. And my crew and my co-pilot said, "We're not leaving this area until we can go pick them up." And I said, "We got a wounded man who was shot in the liver, and he had already taken like 30 pints, and he was going to be taking a lot more blood. They couldn't stop the bleeding." And I said, "Our job is to save the wounded. I love our fellow crewmen, but this is our job." And so I made the decision, we're going to take the guy to Quang Tri, and we're going to save his life, and we'll come back and we'll pick up the other guys. Now, we weren't the only dust-off aircraft there. There was 3 of us. So there was another one of our aircraft that, had the guys been ready to be picked up, would have gone and got them. But they felt like we had deserted our own buddies. But our job, our mission was to save the wounded, and that's what we were doing. And those guys weren't wounded. They were okay. And by the time we got to Quang Tri, refueled, got back, refueled at Khe Sanh, and got back out to the area where the fighting was, they still hadn't got to the top of the mountain. And they never did forgive me, I don't think. But, you know, you do what you got to do.
Is it not, I mean, as far as the movies, I mean, it's glamorized, romanticized in movies, but, you know, when you're picking up those wounded, I mean, I've heard stories of, you know, blood coming out of the, or when the mission's over, coming out of the gunship or the helicopter. Were there scenes like that, or was it just basically what you described, or were there, you know, in the movies you have the music playing and the slow motion. Did it ever get to seem surreal at times, or was it always just reality for you? I mean, did it get weird at times, or, I mean, you know?
The only thing that, it was just definitely not like the movies. You know, the first few missions you go on, things seem surreal. It's like every first thing that you did, the first time it happens is surreal. First time I was in a mortar attack, I jumped out of my foxhole, the little bunker that we had built, and I'm sitting there going, wow, this is just like the movies. And then someone grabbed me by my butt and dragged me back into the bunker and said, well, you crazy? They're trying to kill us, you know. So every first thing that you do, the first time you get shot at, the first time, you know, it just seems very surreal. After that, it becomes fairly routine. But the one thing that you can't see on TV or in the movies is, or that you not see, but one sense that you don't get to experience in a movie or on TV is the smell again. These guys that we picked up had been in the field a long time. They were ripe. And so the smell of the guys just coming in, just being picked up, just their odor was pretty striking. Also, if they were in any kind of a firefight and they had any kind of a burn patients have a unique smell. A lot of guys used to get sick when we had burn patients on. A lot of our crew would get sick when you had a burn patient. After a while, it was very routine and very real and not surreal at all.
What about debriefing, winding down from missions? How did you guys relieve stress?
Both tours were pretty much the same. We were so constantly working. Either we were first up, second up, third up on a day off. Occasional day off, you did weapons cleaning or you just sat around. Depending on where we were. The first tour, we could go into Saigon, we could go into the USO, down to Benoit. There were plenty of bars and clubs on all the installations, the bigger installations. A lot of guys drank. A lot of guys had friends, girlfriends, locals, you know, stuff like that.
What about drug usage in Vietnam? Maybe not in an aviation unit, but was there...
Oh, we weren't immune. We weren't immune.
Tell me about drug usage in Vietnam.
First tour, I doubt that to give you an example, first tour, if I evacuated 10 overdoses of anything in the entire year I was there, I'll be surprised. My second tour, if I didn't evacuate 10 a month, I would be surprised. So there was a lot more drugs my second tour, which was 70, 71, summer of 70 to summer of 71, than my first tour. I don't know, and in my own unit, I suspect there was probably some marijuana use. A lot of people drank, and so there was a lot of drinking. But you know.
Well, you hear things, so I'm just asking. I've asked some of the veterans that question because, you know, back here at home, when you hear things, you know, you hear, well, that's why they were so messed up when they came back because they used drugs, you know. So I mean, or why the fighting and stuff. But I'm assuming that, you know, maybe in an aviation unit it wasn't as prevalent maybe as the guys on the ground. I don't know.
I don't know. You know.
And why would, is it because of the culture back home versus World War II or Korea? Why were there drugs in Vietnam? I mean, you know, was it harder fighting than World War II or Korea? So you kind of ask questions like that, you know.
You know, the World War II and Korea, see, we've romanticized World War II. We make it seem like it was so organized and all the missions and the battles were so choreographed. When the commonality between World War II and Vietnam is combat is chaos, no matter how you look at it. The difference in Vietnam is we kept having chaos over the same piece of land over and over again. You fight for it, you go away, you come back, and then you fight for it again. When Patton roared through France, he left behind him free France as he went through France. We roared through Vietnam, and we had to keep coming back for the last 100 yards, every 200 or 300 yards, or maybe it wasn't that bad, but it's no different. It was hell in World War II, it's hell in Korea, it's hell in Vietnam, it's hell in Iraq, it was hell in Bosnia, it's hell in Afghanistan. It's just a different kind of war. I'm talking about a guerrilla war as opposed to easily identifiable units of verifiable countries engaged in combat. So the intelligence was different. You could pick up a German soldier carrying a specific kind of a weapon in a certain kind of a uniform, and you would know immediately he was in this kind of unit, he was in this kind of platoon, he was in that, and that was his MOS. In Vietnam and in Korea and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, you pick up a guy, you don't know where he's from, you don't know what unit he's in, you don't know what kind of a unit he is. So that's the difference between the wars. Whether that creates more apprehension and more difficulties for the individual soldier, I think not. I think it's just a different set of circumstances. I think the 60s, which were, when marijuana and LSD and cocaine, well, not so much cocaine, but other drugs were so prevalent in our society in general, that our units in Vietnam, who are mirrors of our own society, our young men are our young men, they came from our society, their habits were pretty much the same as society in general. And in that light, if you take all of the drug users in the United States in the 60s and divided them by the total population in the 60s, you got a pretty small number. It's the same case in Vietnam. You get a pretty small number. But that sells airtime. That sells TV time. That makes for good movies. Like people flying in to the Flight of the Valkyries, flying in with their commander smoking a stogie and saying how we're going to kill some Vietnam. Never happened. Never happened. That's BS. Our soldiers were good soldiers. The number of ones that were bad soldiers, or the ones that were using into drugs and had problems, were such a small piece of our total forces, but they get all the attention. When you see an interview on TV, I'm going to talk as long as you let me on this one. When you see an interview on TV, who do they interview? Guys like me who are vice president of an insurance company, who raise 2 kids, have 6 grandchildren, have a nice house, not a great house, but have wonderful kids, have lots of really good friends, never been arrested, never even hardly had anything more than a traffic ticket. What the hell kind of airtime is that going to sell? Zero. But you take a guy who appears to be disheveled, who's wearing an old tattered uniform, who has been a junkie, that guy would have had a problem, in my estimation, had he not ever even been in the military. So I discount a lot of that stuff as just being easy, nice to play on the movies and TV, not reality.
Coming home, did you have a homecoming? I mean, there were things that happened that weren't nice. I mean, I've heard things were thrown at people, people were cursed at, spit at. What kind of homecoming did you have, or did you have one? Well,
I got shot in April of 68.
Okay, why don't you describe that, what happened to you there?
There was a mission between Long Binh, Phu Loy, and Phuc Vinh, Quan Loy, Lai Khe. It's sort of an area north and west of Saigon, pretty far up north, a little bit, maybe 50, 60 miles north of Saigon. 3 different units were having operations at the same time. And they were using observation helicopters to draw fire and then target with their gunships. The observation helicopter got shot down. And they called for a dust-off, which was normal. And it was like 12:30, I was eating lunch, ran out to the helicopter when we heard the siren. I got the mission, my crew was already there, we got in the aircraft, went out, and as we were coming out to scope out the situation, it was really chaos in the air because there was 3 different units. All 3 units were all operating on 3 different frequencies, on several different frequencies, and so being able to tell who was in charge, who was talking to the guys on the ground. The problem was when the observation helicopter crashed, it crashed upside down and they couldn't shut, the pilots were unconscious, couldn't shut it off. And the engine's running, it's a jet engine, it keeps on running as long as there's fuel to it. So they needed someone to get in there right away and get those guys out of there before it blew up. So someone directed us to land right next to where that aircraft was, and as we're hovering down next to the trees, one of the aircraft calls us on the radio and says, "Get out, get out, get out." Very similar to what's on your tape. Get out, get out. That's where the bad guy shot down the other guy from. As soon as that was out of his mouth, I hear 5 hits, and that's when I got hit. And nobody else on my aircraft got hit. The bullet came through the floor, hit me in the thigh. Some of the bullets came, some of the shrapnel came through, hit me in the wrist and in the chin, because the seat was armored. But it bounced off the seat into my thigh and hit my arm and hit in the face here. I was already pulling pitch when they said get out, so we already cleared the tree line. My co-pilot was already on the controls, and as we turned, we started losing RPM on the engine. You could hear the warning, weep, 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 little sound from the warning bell. And all the gauges were flashing on and off. Our radios were shot out. The fuel was streaming out of the bottom of the aircraft. And we crashed into we crash-landed into a little Firebase of ours, right near us. And another dust-off aircraft that had been en route to help out pulled in right next to us. And as I guess that we were airborne maybe 5 minutes. In that 5 minutes, my medic had pulled the red handles on the back of my seat. Seat tilts back. So I'm lying there on my back. Gives me a shot of morphine in my right hand, right arm. And they write morphine, and they write a little sign on your forehead or something. And by the time we'd crashed, they took me out of my seat, put me on the other dust-off aircraft, and took me to the hospital. By the time I got to the hospital, the morphine had kicked in, and I was singing, and I was having a good time. I was saying, I'm going home, oh boy, I'm going home. And I didn't go home. They operated on me, and they sent me up to Cameron Bay to recuperate for about 4 weeks. I came back, and I still wasn't strong enough to fly. So I didn't feel comfortable yet flying, so they sent me to Japan for a reevaluation of my wounds. And once I got to Japan, they said, we're just going to send you home, and they sent me home. So when I got home at that time, if you recall, I was at Fort Rucker when we graduated from flight school, and then Fort Bragg. Sylvia went home to stay with my parents in Miami, and I got medevaced to Fort Benning, Georgia. And by then, I was pretty much ambulatory, and I was feeling pretty good. I'd lost some weight. And so I went home on leave. And so there was never any official homecoming. I just got medevaced all the way home. And, but I wore my uniform everywhere. In Miami, I don't think Miami was kind of like San Francisco or something, but everybody knew I was in the military. I never had any problems. I never had anybody throw anything at me. I never had anybody call me a baby killer. In fact, almost everywhere I went, people would ask me questions about Vietnam, people who knew me. I mean, no one off the street would just walk up to me and say, tell me about your experience in Vietnam. But I didn't have any bad experiences at all, none whatsoever. And on the second tour, I got medevaced home a second time because a piece of shrapnel was bothering my leg. So they sent me back home a little early again. This time I went to Fort Rucker. And so I didn't have a parade, that's for sure, but I didn't have any bad experiences. And people today who meet me and know that I was in Vietnam, and who usually they're veterans from other wars, will say, welcome home, thinking I never got a proper welcome home. And I say, thanks a lot, but it's not necessary. I don't feel like anybody had to welcome me home. I did my duty. I was a volunteer. I went you know, I went into the Army. All my missions were all volunteer. Both of my assignments were volunteer. I had, you know, I even volunteered for my second tour. When I went back for the second tour, I volunteered to go back. And most of the guys in the dust-off units were volunteers.
Have you ever been back to the wall in Washington?
Yes, more than once.
Tell me the first time you were there and what you experienced. You remember?
I think the first wall I saw was a traveling wall. You know, they have the traveling wall that goes around, and I think the first one I saw was a traveling wall, but I'm not sure.
Was it emotional for you to see?
No.
Okay.
I would look for the names of the crew that we'd lost, because we'd lost several different crews during my 2 tours. Not a lot, but we lost a few. And I would look up their names just to see where they were. Some of my classmates were lost. And a lot of the guys who died over there didn't die from enemy fire. They died from bad judgment, pilot error. We found their names. I get more emotional now looking at some of the documentaries and some of the tapes and reliving it now. And I'm not sure if that's emotional because I am sorry for things that happened, or am I nostalgic for a time when I was so loaded with adrenaline that if you poked me, I would spurt, you know. And so it would be, I can't tell you if it's emotion over guys who passed. I know a lot of guys who passed away, and I'm sorry for them. I really feel for them, and I think they're heroes. But I don't burst into tears. I don't have flashbacks. I've never had dreams about Vietnam and about things like that. And I think part of that is because when I got home, I joined the National Guard. I flew with guys who'd just come back from Vietnam. We had a lot of windshield time flying missions here in Arizona, all over the place. And most of the guys that I would deal with were all National Guardsmen, all business people. They all had jobs, they all had families, they all had careers, and they came together on the weekends to do their National Guard duty, but they were all normal guys. And so,
David, tell me about any sights, sounds, or smells today that bring back memories of Vietnam.
Kerosene, that brings back, the smell of kerosene brings it back. The sound, we have a plant here that builds Boeing aircraft, Apaches and the other aircraft, I forget what they build, but when I hear rotor blades, I feel I could fly that. So those kinds of things remind me of Vietnam, but not necessarily of Vietnam, just the flying. Now, I was never really that fond of flying. In fact, I get airsick. But I'm a lot less fond of walking. And so, remember I said that I knew I wanted to be a pilot. I went through the rotary wing program, never got sick, especially when I'm flying, when I'm in the cockpit. But I also went through, between tours, I went through fixed wing transition. I flew fixed wing. I was airsick every day. And they tried to wash me out of that program because I was airsick, but they needed pilots so bad that.
We're almost out of time. You're doing great, but boy, what was I just going to ask you?
Let me just make one quick comment.
Yeah.
Some of the real heroes that I worked with were the medics and the crew chiefs. I was the driver of the bus, and we had a certain skill set, and we got the people from the battlefield into the hospitals. But I couldn't work on them and fly the helicopter. The guys that kept them alive, in some cases brought them back to life, but in every case, the guys that kept them alive and cared for them and made sure that they were alive when they left my aircraft, those are the medics and the crew chiefs, and they deserve an unbelievable amount of credit. I got a lot of ribbons and a lot of awards, but those guys really, actually, they personally, hands-on, saved lives. And
what did you get your rewards for? What type of citation?
I was awarded 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. One of them was by General Hay of the 1st Infantry Division. And my commander of the 44th Med Brigade didn't like the fact that he gave me a Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission that we did, and so he downgraded it and turned it into an air medal. He didn't like the fact that this guy is politics. All awards are politics. I've got like 33 air medals, some of them for valor. I've got Bronze Star, several Army Commendation medals.
What did you get the Bronze Star for?
Service. Every officer who served in the 101st got a Bronze Star.
Tell me just quickly, the Huey Helicopter, give me just a quick brief overview of all the different things. It was the workhorse. Tell me just a little bit about the Huey again.
The Huey is,
Vietnam.
the one we flew was a single engine, twin-bladed, twin rotor, gross weight 9,500 pounds, operating weight about 6,600 pounds. It was a workhorse, so you can carry about a 3,000 pound payload. It was a low silhouette. It was designed during the Korean War as an alternative to the H-34s and the H-19s, which is the kind you see where the pilots sit way up on top and there's a little bubble in front, but they're sitting way up on top. Well, those present a big target. And the Huey was developed specifically for medevac, for dust-off. But it got used when the first Cav was building, I don't know if you've seen Mel, what's his name's movie. I think that's it, where they show how the first Cav got started from the 21st Infantry Division, I think, or something. They integrated that and became air mobile. It became an air mobile division, and then the 101st became air mobile, and some of the other divisions became air mobile. So it did yeoman's work. I mean, the majority of the work in Vietnam was done by Hueys. Some of them carried weapons, some of them didn't. The Cobra, which was a gunship, is a variation of a Huey. It had a different silhouette. It was tandem seat and it only carried 2 people, but the engine was the same as the engine in ours. A Lycoming L13, 1,300 horsepower at 100-degree day. Was a big improvement over the D models that we had before, which were rated for the same horsepower, but at a standard degree day, which is like 67 degrees. And I never saw a 67-degree day in the entire time I was in Vietnam. So we had full horsepower at 100 degrees.
Are you proud that you're a Vietnam veteran?
Absolutely. No doubt about it. And the guys that, all of the guys that served, no doubt about it. I have no qualms and no regrets. We were professional soldiers. We did what our country asked us to do. It wasn't our job to question why. It was our job to do it. And that doesn't mean that we had thoughts about the war. Everybody had thoughts about the war. But the people that I know and that I associated with and associate with today, whether they're World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or people who are current serving on active duty, we take our job very seriously. We're professional soldiers. Our country asked us to do a job, and we do it.
Did you feel like were you conscious of fighting for God and country over there, or was it just survival or just a job, or how did you feel about that?
That's a good question. I felt I was doing it for country. We used to have something called articles, what we call the articles of Code of Conduct. And the first article of the Code of Conduct I memorized when I was in basic training. I was supposed to memorize them all. There was like 5 of them. I memorized one. I am an American fighting man. I fight in the forces which guard my country and my way of life, and I'm prepared to give my life in their defense. And that's how we felt about it. Now, that has nothing to do with God. I believe that I have an angel watching over me. I'm not going to tell you what religious preference I am, but there's no doubt that somebody has been watching over me for many ways for all my life, for all the situations I've been in, and we're totally thankful for that. But I wasn't fighting for God, or I was a member of my country's army. That's what I was fighting for.
What does the American flag mean and represent to you, David?
Well, I sure don't like people who burn it. On the other hand, I have no problem in a mission that defends their right to burn it. So I have a right to pick and choose my friends, however. So the American flag stands for our way of life, stands for our democracy, stands for freedom, all kinds of freedoms. And I don't feel that it's more than just a symbol. People died for our flag. And I would rather see them burn replicas of the Constitution or something, because that's a real political statement. But the flag, to me, is a symbol of things that people died for. I guess the Constitution, people died for that too as well. But maybe that's a bad example. But as far as the flag is concerned, it's a symbol of everything that we stand for. And I'm not quite ready to say it's something that's revered, you know, in a religious kind of a sense, but it sure is to be honored.
One more question. What does freedom mean to you? Or tell me about the price for freedom.
The price of freedom? Well, there's only soldiers know what the price for freedom is. Those who serve, and now it's a total voluntary force. So what their sacrifice is the price for freedom. And freedom is the ability to live in a country where you can start off as a nobody, as a baby, in a normal family and grow up to be President of the United States. Or be born in a rich family and grow up to be President of the United States. And anybody who has the guts and the drive to be somebody will. And I don't know, freedom is kind of like a nebulous term, because we really aren't totally free. I mean, we can't yell fire in a movie theater. We have rules that limit certain kinds of speech and certain kinds of activities. But freedom to me means the ability to choose how you want to live your life within certain well-defined limits that are defined by the society.
I don't know if I can get this whole thing in, but what does Vietnam mean to you today? I mean, looking back, does it have any significance in your life anymore, the Vietnam War?
Well, it defined us. It defined me. I mean, I grew up in Vietnam, pretty much. But it's not Vietnam that did that. It's the Army that did it. If you ask me about Vietnam, well, yeah, I was there. If you ask me about the Army, I'm proud I was a soldier. And I have wonderful feelings about being in the Army, and I would recommend to anybody who has a problem deciding where they want to go in life, try the military, any branch of the military service, as a way of helping define who you might want to be in your future life.
One more thing. I ask all the veterans this. Can I have you where you're seated into the camera? When I ask you, could you give me a salute into the camera?
Sure.
Okay, sir, right in the camera. Great. Excellent. Well, I don't know if we can clap, but...
That was good.